I think both of us right now we're twinning on the suits combination, so that's probably a good sign,
Very good.
for sure. But ladies and gentlemen, hello, welcome to Billable Time. My name is Mo Hussain. I'm a rising 2L dual JD at the University of Detroit Mercy and the University of Windsor. And in this podcast, I talk to lawyers, judges, law students, and other legal professionals to learn more about their journeys and what rising legal professionals like myself can learn and sort of get better in the process. And I have a very, very, very special guest, Mr. Adam Goldenberg, who's a partner at McCarthy Tétrault. So, Adam, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, Mo. Good to talk to you.
Adam, I'd love to just ask, what is it like being you?
I love my job. I wake up every morning excited about the kinds of cases that I get to work on, the difficult and challenging and interesting problems that I get to help clients solve, and the super smart, hardworking teams that I get to work with here at McCarthy's. I started in private practice, not expecting to love it, not expecting to stick with it for more than a couple of years. And here I am a decade later with no intention of doing anything else. So that's been a pleasant surprise over the course of my career. And what's kept me at it is the variety of interesting different cases that I get to do and the incredible people that I get to work with.
100%, 100%. Yeah, and that's obviously, with your career, even just reading about it. I remember I was just watching a podcast, I think it was the Unisolve question, and just hearing about a variety of different things, whether it's your undergrad journey, even just being working in private practice and clerking for the Supreme Court. You've done a lot for the legal profession. And so, like, prior to that, what sort of inspired you into pursuing the practice of law?
I think I always knew from the time I was a high school kid at the latest that being a lawyer or at least going to law school was something I was interested in doing. I was a debater in high school. I always loved reading the paper and thinking about the challenging problems that other people were having to solve. I was always interested in politics and public policy, and that carried on through my time in university. In undergrad, I wrote a column for the school paper. I was involved in student government. And so I'm one of those people that comes from that background for whom litigation seemed like a great way to channel the sorts of skills that I developed over the course of my upbringing and over the course of my education
Mhm.
into something that would be productive and interesting. And I also knew because I'd worked in politics before I went to law school
Mhm.
that I would be interested in the kinds of public policy issues that lawyers get to be involved with, both in the public law context, and I do a lot of administrative law and constitutional law cases where public policy is always part of the discussion in the foreground, but also in the private law context. When you do a case about the duties of good faith that arise under contract law in Canada, there is a very strong public policy element to how we govern business relationships between individuals, or in tort law, the way that we interact with one another in a society.
Wow.
Those are the rules of the game when it comes to the development of the common law in that area. And all of those aspects and all of those dimensions of developing the law, working with the law, solving problems through the law has always been interesting to me at an abstract level. And so I always knew I wanted to get to know that area of the world, that area of the professional sector through education. And as I said a moment ago, I then thought, okay, I'll give it a try in private practice, and the rest is history.
What's unique about your academic journey is that, a lot of people in terms of working at, especially at a firm like McCarthy's or a variety of different, Canadian firms, usually you kind of go into either UFT undergrad, you either go to McGill, maybe UBC, and then you kind of move on to that. But in your case, you kind of took a little bit of the American route from a standpoint of Harvard, Yale, but with that, very, very prestigious institutions in the United States. And then leading you back into Canada, I'd love to learn about what kind of led to that inspiration in terms of not only going down there, but also coming back home essentially, and then taking that education and knowledge base into Canada.
Sure. I mean, I don't think I have a more elegant answer for why I went down to the US for university than I got in. I went to a high school where every year or two there would be one or two students who would go to an American university. And it was something that I was interested in exploring. I had done Model United Nations and stuff in high school, and we had traveled to some of these places for conferences, which was every bit as nerdy as it sounds in hindsight. And I applied to Harvard as a grade 12 student, and they admitted me. And I wasn't, I actually had to convince my parents that this was something worth pursuing for undergrad.
Oh, really?
Yeah, oh yeah, their attitude, having grown up in Toronto, gone to U of T. They met in medical school there.
Mhm.
They thought, well, you should stay in Canada for undergrad. In fact, they wanted me to stay in Vancouver and go to
Oh.
UBC. And then you can always go to a fancy American school for graduate school.
Mhm.
What ended up convincing them and me that it was something I wanted to do for undergrad was not the prestige so much as the collegiate experience that you get at an American university, where you are living and breathing and eating and working and studying with a group of people in a residential college type of environment. And there are some schools in Canada that do that really well, but it was something that I really wanted in grade 12. And so that led to the direction that I took. And as I say, when they gave me the offer to attend, it was something I felt I couldn't
A
say no.
no-brainer, yeah.
And so I went for undergrad. I had an amazing 4 years. By the time I got to my third and fourth year of undergrad, I had developed a very strong sense that I wanted to come back to Canada. I actually wrote a piece for the school paper, which is still out there on the internet somewhere, about returning to Canada and how that was something that I wrestled with. Because when you're at an international institution like Harvard, you are confronted with opportunities all over the world.
Yeah.
And as you're suggesting in your question, there's a well-trod path to the private sector in the US or the public sector in the US or in any event, a number of career paths that are open to you in the United States. And that's why I think many people who go to these universities as undergraduates or go to them for law school end up pursuing careers in the US and oftentimes don't come back to Canada at all. I knew those opportunities were available to me and there were social pressures to pursue them, but I just had this undeniable sense that I wanted to come home.
Wow.
Um, and I didn't initially. I first moved to Europe after undergrad and took a job at the World Food Program, which is the UN's humanitarian agency. But then what was supposed to be a year-long stint there got interrupted by the financial crisis. This was in late 2008. I ended up moving back to Vancouver and back into my parents' house. And no sooner did I step off the plane than the 2008 federal election was called. And I got involved working in the local Liberal campaign, helping Liberal candidates in BC in what was an unsuccessful election. Stéphane Dion lost to Stephen Harper, you'll recall, in that 2008 election, which was to date, to that point in time, the worst election result for the Liberal Party in a very,
Yeah.
very long time. And Stéphane Dion ended up resigning. Michael Ignatieff ended up becoming the leader, and I ended up working for him for 2.5 years. So I came back to Canada because I wanted to be home, and then I stayed because I had this really cool opportunity to work in politics and to be part
100%.
of shaping the country that way. Not ultimately all that effectively, because we all know what happened in 2011. The Liberal Party went down to an even worse defeat than
Yeah,
in
yeah.
2008. And Michael, for whom I have enormous respect and admiration, was not successful in his attempt to lead the Liberal Party to victory. He stepped down as leader on election night. And I, by that point, had applied to law schools and had gotten in both in Canada and at Yale in the US. And I had spent a long time deferring the decision of where to go because just as an undergrad, I had a strong sense that I wanted to end up back in Canada. I struggled with the idea of leaving the country again and going to university for law school outside of Canada. I knew I had a very strong sense that this is where I wanted my life to be. It's where I wanted to end up after law school. So why go to an
Yeah,
American university that's
100%.
more expensive than a Canadian university, that's farther away from home, and that again leads to most obviously career paths in a country that I wasn't intending to end up in. And ultimately, what propelled me to Yale for law school was similar to what propelled me to Harvard for undergrad, which was it's just such an incredible opportunity to be able to go to a place like that. And I remember after speaking to my friends and colleagues in politics for a very long time about making this decision and which of these offers should I accept, which law school should I go to. One of my buddies said, and I'm going to clean up his language a bit. For heaven's sake, you got into Yale. Just go to
Yeah.
Yale. And that ended up being the decision. And I don't have, again, a more elegant explanation than that.
That's
I
okay.
never once have regretted it. It was an incredible 3 years. The friends that I made there now, 10 years after law school, are going on to positions of real influence in the United States and elsewhere. And positions in the academy and in public service, which has been really impressive to watch. And it's cool to have that network. But it was the 3 years of actually being in that hothouse of ideas. The way that Yale does legal education is different than I think any other law school. And there have
Yeah.
been many who've emulated it in different ways. But it was the right environment for me. And I loved my time there. But again, by the time I got to 2L and I was looking at summer jobs, which is a position that a lot of folks are in right now,
Absolutely, yeah.
and I applied both to firms in New York and to firms in Toronto. I applied to firms in New York because I thought, well, I'm here and I've got that opportunity. I
Might
should,
as well. Yeah.
yeah, play it out a bit, see what the options end up being. And then Toronto, because that's where I instinctively again knew that I wanted to end up. That was the plan when I went to law school, and I wasn't yet ready to give up on it. And I interviewed in both places, and really enjoyed meeting the lawyers that I met in New York, and the firms there are super impressive institutions that have incredible work and incredibly smart people to work with. And New York is incredibly exciting as a place.
You can't go wrong with it. Yeah.
And it was there was a real gravitational pull. And the way the interviews played out is I interviewed in New York first. I got job offers there. I was allowed to keep them open until I'd interviewed in Canada because sometimes they let you split your summer and do half of it in a Toronto firm and half of it in a New York firm. And then I interviewed in Toronto a few months later, and by the end of that process, was convinced that I wanted to come back to Canada. I was confirmed in what had been my initial thinking that this is where I wanted to be, both because of the substantive experience that I thought I would have as a summer student and as a junior lawyer. I assumed and was correct in this that as a young lawyer in our system, in our market, as a litigator in particular, you get many more on your feet opportunities, so to speak, and literally in litigation, many more opportunities to argue cases, to cross-examine witnesses, to lead cases
Yeah.
within the first few years of practice, which aren't available, I think, at least not in the same way at large firms in the United States. You can get those experiences in pro bono matters, but oftentimes, if you want to be a litigator in the US, you have to leave big law, go and be a prosecutor for a couple of years to get
Yeah.
trial experience, and then come back as a more senior lawyer. And I thought, I don't know how long I'm going to practice law anyway. I want to get that experience early, and the place to do that was going to be Canada. And then the second reason, and again, I think this was the right decision for me, is I got a very strong sense as I was interviewing at firms in Toronto of the community that the legal profession is here. It's a much smaller market, not much smaller, but it is markedly smaller than New York. The bar feels more intimate, particularly in
Wow.
the litigation context. You know people, there's a community here, and it means something to be a barrister in our system, in
Wow.
our city. And that was something of which I wanted to be part. And so that on top of what had been my predisposition to want to return to Canada made the decision a clear one for me at the time.
I'd love to learn more about how the experience so finish up at Yale and then Supreme Court of Canada.
Mm.
What an incredible experience that must have been. Adam, talk to me about how that shaped your legal career and what impact that had on the way that you practice today.
Sure. I mean, I'll include both my clerkships
Okay,
in this.
yeah, sounds
They
good.
were no, not because I want to make sure your listeners know I clerked not once but twice. But because they were very different experiences,
Okay.
and I valued and still value both of them extremely highly. So right out of law school, I clerked at the Court of Appeal for Ontario here in Toronto. I worked for three amazing judges, Justices Simmons, Justice Cronk, and McPherson, who taught me a huge amount about how to be an effective advocate, being able to sit through the high volume of cases that the Court of Appeal for Ontario hears across the full panoply of law. I mean, you hear civil matters, they hear bankruptcy matters, they hear cases involving criminal allegations, they hear family cases, like you work on all of them, whole thing. And I think the Court of Appeal for Ontario hears something like 1,500 cases a year. So there's just a ton of case law that you have to ingest as a judge there and as a clerk there, and a huge variety of advocacy that you get to watch. And so you talk to the judges and they say, you got to come to court today. Such and such an advocate is going to be there, and you really need to see them on their feet. It's going to teach you something. And sometimes you would attend court because you knew you'd be called upon to assist with a judgment afterwards, and you would see really bad advocacy, and you would learn from that. Or advocacy, I'm a very good advocate, but just didn't go well with that particular set of judges, and you learn from that experience.
Wow.
So working at the Court of Appeal taught me a great deal about civil litigation in Ontario. It got me exposed to the bar here, which I mentioned a moment ago,
Yeah.
that community of advocates and understanding the different advocacy traditions that are reflected by different law firms and different lawyers in our market. And you can see those patterns when you see a high volume of advocacy as a law clerk, which was really important to thinking about where I wanted to land in my career when I came to practice, and also thinking about the kinds of cases I wanted to work on, and also how to be effective in front of a busy court, which most of the time is where we are as litigators. We're in front of trial judges or appeal judges who have very high caseloads and who really need your assistance as a lawyer to make things simpler for them, to make their jobs clearer, to help them understand the nuances of the case, which you are going to know better than the judge because you've been living with it as the advocate, and also help them wrestle through the problems that they have, understanding your client's point of view or seeing things the way you want the court to see them. And lawyers who come to court and make things complicated for a judge or a panel of judges that has an awful large stack of cases to get through that week or
Yeah.
that day are not as successful as those who can come in and clarify and be of assistance to the court. So working with a busy appellate court taught me that in a very direct way, and that's stuck with me the whole way through practice. In the Supreme Court of Canada, which is also busy, but not with nearly the
Yeah.
volume that the Court of Appeal for Ontario has, um, I learned a huge amount about thinking through difficult legal problems that don't have a clear answer, that
Yeah.
haven't been addressed before. The cases that make it to the Supreme Court are cases where there isn't a simple or straightforward answer, where you have to go back to first principles and reason about why the law is the way it is and what should the law be, and how do you take the tools of the common law or of the statute law that you're applying and get them to a point where you can do justice between the parties in a particular case and develop the law in a way that will allow other courts to do justice between other parties in other cases. That's a really exciting problem to have, an exciting challenge to confront. Uh, I mean, and the judges that sit on that court have to do that every day, years on end. As a clerk, you get a brief glimpse of that work and of that the machinery that supports it and of the thinking that goes into the decisions that come from that court. And so to be able to assist, I got to work for Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin, who is a hero to me and a wonderful mentor and a person who I'm delighted to have in my life still as someone that I look up to and so deeply respect and have learned a ton from. And thinking about the law at the very highest level, where you have to both entertain law in its abstraction, law at the level of principle, and also in the very concrete terms that ultimately have to be brought to bear on deciding an actual case between actual parties. Being able to think at both of those valences, being able to think at those different tiers of analysis at the same time, I think teaches you to be an effective advocate, not only in an appellate court, not only in the Supreme Court of Canada, where again, as counsel, your job is to assist the court in doing that job. But it helps you when you get a new problem, when you get a new case, when a client calls and says, I've got this situation, what should I do? It allows you to provide deeper
Wow.
analysis, deeper advice than just saying, well, here's the most recent case and that's what it says, so that must be the answer. Thinking about what makes this particular problem different from the case that the court decided last week or last month. Thinking about what makes this particular problem interesting potentially or not interesting, and why it isn't something that has to be addressed at the level of principle is a skill that I think has been useful to me in advising my clients and representing my clients over time. And then, of course, having worked at the Supreme Court set me up, I think, very well for doing advocacy in the Supreme Court, which has always been part of my practice, because I've seen and I've spent a year hearing from the
Absolutely.
judges themselves about what works, what doesn't, seeing very effective advocacy, seeing less effective advocacy, the same way as at the Court of Appeal, I had that opportunity for Ontario litigation. So for any of the law students watching who are thinking about applying to clerk, absolutely you should. I encourage every law student who is in a position to pursue that opportunity to do so. They were two of the most wonderful years of my time since law school. They are not as great as practicing law, in my view. People who say it's the best year and then it's all downhill after that, that's really depressing. That's not my experience. But I love those opportunities and I learned a ton from the judges that I got to work with and the clerks that I got to work with. Some of my closest friends, both in the profession and generally, are people with whom I clerked both here in Toronto and in Ottawa. And so if you're thinking about applying, do it.
100%. I love your enthusiasm towards the law and just being a litigator. I find that sometimes you run to the casual Reddit post, I hate my life, I'm this and that. And it's just frustrating, because like at the end of the day, all of us got into this journey for a reason, but seeing someone as enthusiastic as you about every step of the way is more
Yeah.
refreshing than usual.
And I'm with you, Mo. Like when I see lawyers on social media or elsewhere talk about their practices with this deflated sense of disappointment or with the kind of grudging acknowledgement that this is their job and isn't it terrible? Like that's so sad.
Yeah.
And I understand that, people end up in the situation where they've been through law school, they've taken on an enormous amount of debt to get a legal education, and they have to have a job that's sufficiently well remunerated to make the finances work.
Mhm.
That is a problem that I hope fewer and fewer law students
Yeah.
can end up in as they learn more about the types of opportunities that are available to them and don't end up in positions where they have to do a job that they don't like. That is something that I think every one of us as lawyers does ultimately have the power to avoid. Maybe not for a couple of years. Like, look, if you've got to pay off your debt and you've got to work in a job that you don't love for a few years, fine, do it. Get that done. That's totally legit. But it's the people who then stay in those jobs for
Yeah.
decades in some cases that I just see as a totally missed opportunity to use the magic of a legal education, the power of a legal education and of membership in this profession to find something that you can do that's exciting. I mean, the thing about law school, the reason why so many people go to law school who don't have a clear idea about whether they want to be a lawyer or not, that's me, or who just aren't sure what kind of lawyer they want to be, even if they're pretty sure they do want to be a lawyer, is that it opens up so many different opportunities. And this profession is so broad and so deep that there is a place for every single person who goes to law school to find professional fulfillment. And it doesn't have to be at a firm like mine. It may not be at a firm like mine. For most people, it isn't at a firm like mine. We work really hard. We have a certain routine that is demanding to a level that not everybody can accommodate because of the demands on them on their personal lives or because just of their preferences. And there's no failure in that. There's nothing wrong with that. But recognizing that and knowing where you can find legal opportunities in a legal career that matches who you are and the kind of law you want to practice is the single most important thing, not just for a law student, but for a lawyer. So for me, like I check in with myself all the time. If I ever feel differently than you're hearing me communicate to you now about my job, if I wake up one day and think I'm not learning anything anymore, I'm not loving this anymore, I think I have an obligation to myself with the incredible privilege that I have to be a lawyer with the opportunities I've had to date to find something else to do, to put my talents to use, my skills to use in some other way so that I can feel that fulfillment. You only get one shot at having a professional life and a life generally. And it would be a misuse of that opportunity, I think, of the privilege of being a lawyer, to spend your career somewhere that doesn't fit the kind of lawyer that you want to be, because somewhere out there is an opportunity that fits better, and it's incumbent on each of us to know when we aren't in the right place and to find the right place when we are in a position where we need to make a change. And there's no moral judgment attached to that at all. I
Yeah.
think one of the problems that I think lawyers and particularly law students have is that we create in our minds this completely false hierarchy of the profession where at the top are the big firms. And like if you're a law student, oh, that's I should want to go there. I should want to get a job at a big firm if you're in Ontario, in Toronto. Um, I think there's a lot of students who think that way, and that's not a healthy way or a right way or
Wow.
an accurate way to think. Just as when I was in university in the States and there was subtle social pressure to look at opportunities in New York in the private sector in the big American cities, because that's just the environment that I was in. The same thing happens in law school. And I think that when I talk to law students and they say they want to come work at McCarthy's, I think that's wonderful. And I want everybody to want to work at my firm, but only if you really do, and only if you really want to do the kind of work that we get to do. And if it's not for you, I'm not feeling judged by that. And I'm not going to judge you for having different preferences or a different vision for your career. Go out there and find the place where you get to be the lawyer that you can be and that you want to be.
Wow. Can I just say first and foremost, if there's ever an Adam Goldenberg, a motivational speaking corporation, I will gladly be general counsel for this. I will
You're
gladly,
hired.
I'll gladly work on that. No, that's incredibly valuable. And even just as I'm talking to you right now, like, obviously I'm experiencing it. A lot of my classmates are experiencing it, and the pressure to land, I guess is the best way, is like you'd see people just working their face off, deteriorating health, stuff like that. And at the end of the day, like you mentioned, it's important, most important to find your place. And I came from a journalism background. I thought I was going to be a broadcaster like Adrian Arsenault for for the rest of my life. Great person, by the way. But I eventually decided, well, okay, I'm going to be this hotshot media executive, and I'm going to work. And then I do my first moon. I'm like, I like this. Like, okay, I'll. Then I do my first case competition. I like this, and it just you kind of that thing of finding your way. And sometimes even people ask me, should I go to law school? I go because you're gonna like find your path at some point. So that's certainly incredibly valuable for a lot of people, whether you're a law student or you're thinking about it as well. And so just transitioning into that, you touched a little bit about students right now, and a lot of people applying to different firms. For people that, let's say, either want to land at whether it's your firm or a top firm in Toronto, if that is their goal and they're sure of it, I guess, like you mentioned before, under that premise, what would be your advice for that in the midst of 1,200 different applications that you see? Like, what would be the advice in terms of standing out in that process?
So I think that we look for leaders. We look for students who are going to be leading members of the profession, who have a commitment to excellence, who want to be the best, who want to work with the best, who want to do cases that are the most exciting, the most consequential in the country, and that who have a track record of taking the initiative and taking on challenging assignments, challenging work, and excelling at that work. So we look for that kind of a track record and that kind of a story first and foremost, because excellence in our recruiting is priority number one. We also look for resilience. This is a tough job. There are setbacks in every legal practice. And we look for folks who have overcome adversity or otherwise demonstrated a resilience in the way that they've lived their life or gotten to the point that they're applying to us. And so there's no one way that that story can be told. There's no one recipe for demonstrating these sorts of characteristics. But if you've made it through law school while raising a family, that's super impressive to us. And we want to hear that part of your story. If you've made it through law school while working two jobs and you've taken on leadership positions or management positions in one of those jobs while also being on a student organization, like that's incredibly impressive. And I'm not saying that you have to have these things. You could be a top student and work on the law journal and have editorial responsibility there and have been a research assistant for a professor. In different ways, that tells the same kind of story and demonstrates the same commitment to excellence, resilience, leadership, entrepreneurialism, innovation. These sorts of commitments are things that we value very highly. We also think it's very important that our legal group, our talent looks like the communities that we serve in the country in which we practice law. And so we prioritize going after the very best talent from every possible background, from every possible set of circumstances. We want to be the kind of workplace, and I think we are the kind of workplace where we are always looking at what are the barriers to an individual lawyer achieving their potential and achieving the excellence to which they can commit themselves. And so when we are doing student recruitment, we also want to ensure that we are eliminating barriers to the very best students coming to work with us, whoever they are, whatever they look like, wherever they're from. And so all of that together, we think over time has allowed us to assemble student classes that are exceptional and that have members that are the very best students in the country and who are able to apply themselves to the kinds of challenges that clients entrust us to solve in order to deliver the very best work for them, working in diverse teams across the country in our national platform. So I can't speak for other firms. I think that
100%.
most big firms in Toronto will all tell a variety of that. We're all looking for students who are going to come in the door eager to learn, eager to contribute, and who see themselves as future leaders of our firm and of our profession. That's what we're looking for. And we're looking for people for whom spending some time at McCarthy's, whether it's 40 years or 4 years or a year, is going to be an important part of their professional journey, and who will be proud to call alumni of our firm, whether they leave at retirement or after working with us for a couple of years. That's what we're looking for in summer students. And so if that's you, applications are due soon, I think.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah. I'd love to know sort of how you've managed to excel at every level of sort of your career to a certain degree, and how you've kind of managed to sustain that level of performance throughout. Because a lot of people would say a lot of have different, oh, well, they only have one run of excellence in one area, but you've managed to consistently do that throughout your career. I'd love to learn more about how you've managed to do so.
Well, I'm very flattered by the premise of that question. Not sure I entirely accept it, but I'll accept the purpose of giving you my best answer. I think my attitude toward basically anything is it's not worth doing something unless you can do it really well. And recognizing that that almost never is something that requires limited effort. My approach to the different activities in which I've engaged in myself over the course of my kind of educational career and then professional career subsequently have been motivated by taking on things that are interesting, that I find something to get excited about, and then pushing myself really hard to be good at those things, to seek excellence and to seek to achieve whatever my potential might be in that area. So when it comes to school and when I was in law school, like I wasn't the person who read every single page of every single case before every class. Like I think the statute of limitations is run now. I think I can admit this. There were classes for which I did very little reading at all. And
The
and
ABA is not watching. I don't think so. So it's good.
I think that my approach instead was, how do I get the result that I want to get while putting in an amount of effort that will get that without overdoing it, so
100%.
that I have time to pursue other things. I wrote pieces for different publications, and I was on TV sometimes when I was in law school, and I made time for that by being efficient and by choosing to do the work that would get me the result without committing more time than I needed to. In subsequent chapters of my career, when I've been doing cases and pursuing clerkships and those sorts of things, you have to figure out quickly how much effort it's going to take in order to achieve the result you want to achieve, to deliver on the commitment to a client, to prepare a factum or a cross-examination that is the very best it can be within the constraints in which you're operating.
That's
I actually
a key point with that.
Totally. And I think that, like all of litigation is a compromise with time. If I had infinite time and infinite resources to work on any particular factum, I could keep refining it forever. I
Yeah,
read briefs when I'm getting ready to argue a case, and I'll read the factum that we worked on months before, and I'll find 10 things that I would have changed or tweaked. Not that necessarily would have made it better in an objective sense, but that I just would have changed to continue trying to improve it on
100%.
my own. But the world doesn't work that way. You've got to put an end to every activity, and you only have a
Yeah.
certain amount of time. The client's only prepared to fund a certain amount of legal work. And so getting to a level of excellence within the constraints of hours of a day or dollars in a budget provided by a client or days before a deadline when something is due is something that I didn't consciously develop when I was in school. But I think because I was engaged in so many different extracurriculars, so many different activities inside and outside, both of undergrad and law school, I almost implicitly or accidentally learned that skill of prioritizing and triaging the different things on my plate, of managing my time, but motivated always by a desire to be the very best at the things that I set out to be involved in. And sometimes you succeed and sometimes you don't. Our profession is fun and exciting because there are so many people who are extraordinary advocates that I
Yeah.
get to work with and against in different cases. And I'm constantly pushing myself to be as good as any of them. And sometimes I succeed and sometimes I don't. And that is something that motivates me to try harder, to work harder, to push harder. And there's no shortcut to doing any of these things. If you want to be a high performer, and that is my ambition, whether I succeed at it or not. You've got to be prepared to work really hard. One of my partners here at McCarthy's has a line of which is that if you want to play in the NHL, you're going to have to spend a lot of time on the ice and in the gym, and there's no easy way to be at the very top of the profession, any profession,
Hmm.
and that's true. If you want to be at the very top of your law school cohort, if you want to have the opportunity to clerk at the Supreme Court, if you want to compete for the very best files and achieve the very best results for clients in major litigation matters, you have to be prepared to work really, really hard. And to date, I've been able to do that. I've also been extremely privileged. I should acknowledge this, that like I don't have kids. The people who do what I do at the level that I do it and raise a family, I am in awe of those people because they find the time to do what I was describing a moment ago of committing the necessary resources to achieve the optimal result without overcommitting resources and without being inefficient. They are masters of that. You have to be if you're going to be an elite professional and a parent, which I've never had the challenge of doing. I've had the privilege of having a spouse who is supportive of my career and is okay with me being at the office late at night when I've got to prepare a case, who doesn't mind when a weekend that we could have spent going for dinner or doing just spending time together is instead spent preparing a cross-examination that I'm doing the following week. I think because he sees how much I love what I do and how important it is to me to be uh, good at it and to be excellent in the commitments that I take on for clients. I think that is something that I don't take for granted at all. It doesn't hurt that he himself is a lawyer at a big law firm, so he's feeling the same
There's an
pressure.
understanding, I guess.
Totally. But all of these things are things that have allowed me to devote the time necessary to be as good as I can be at the stuff that I take on. And so it's flattering that you say I've done really well at that. I think the last point I'll make, because you've alluded to like different things on my CV, when you get into law practice, and this is for the law students out there, this sort of adornments, the kind of ornaments on your CV, the achievements that you had in law school or in undergrad, very, very quickly fade into the background.
Wow.
It's nice when people are impressed by where I went to undergrad and law school. That feels good, not going to lie. It's a nice thing for my ego, which doesn't need the help. Um, but when I'm actually doing a case, the lawyer on the other side doesn't care where I went to undergrad.
Right.
The client doesn't care where I went to law school. The judge certainly doesn't. What matters is how well are you performing in the role that you are in? How good is your judgment? How able are you to take a really difficult set of problems and make it clear for a decision maker in a manner that helps that person decide the case in your client's favor? And on the client side, how good are you at listening, at being attentive, at not being on your phone during a Zoom call when the client is explaining to you the business problem that they need your help in solving, of being thoughtful and taking the client's challenges on as personally important to you and at least professionally important to you as their counsel. All of that is a billion times more important than what's on your CV. So for law students who are engaged in, if don't worry if you're not on the executive of whatever the student group is that you're part of, or if you lost the election for that position, or if you didn't get to be the editor of this, or you didn't make the moot team for that.
Uh-huh.
These are, you should work hard, take those as invitations to work harder, to figure out what could have gone differently and how to apply yourself in a different way next time. But those sorts of small setbacks are trivia by the time you get into law practice. Focus on the work ethic, the time management, and the skill development that will allow you to provide excellent client service and be an excellent lawyer, a legal professional, if it's what I do, an advocate in a courtroom. And that is the sort of thing that will carry you forward through your career rather than anything that's on your resume.
Just building on that sort of, whether it's, in law practice and whatnot, you deal with a lot of different high pressure litigation cases, high pressure environments. The other partner mentioned, playing for the NHL has its costs and has certain, barriers that come into it. And so with that, and for law students going in, whether even articling students, what would kind of advice you would say to kind of stay grounded or to kind of take care of yourself, especially when the pressure and pace and just the nature of the profession is so can become overwhelming.
Yeah. So there are two imperatives for every lawyer at every stage, but figuring out how to balance these two competing imperatives as a junior lawyer is, I think, the single most important thing that a new lawyer or a student in a law firm or in private practice generally has to learn. On the one hand, experience is everything. If you take on every different challenge, if you say yes to opportunities, if you take on the extra case, if you do the extra examination, if you jump at the opportunity to get on your feet, to work with a new person, to try a new area of law, to handle a different kind of case, and always have that attitude, you will grow more quickly and you will have a much richer set of experiences on which to draw when, as a more senior lawyer, you're called upon to deliver your judgment for a client's benefit. And so my approach as a junior lawyer, for example, was to say yes to everything. That was the old advice, always say yes. Uh, People interpret that as, because if you don't, you're going to get a reputation as someone who doesn't say yes, and that's bad for you, like in the internal politics of a
Yeah,
workplace.
yeah,
That's toxic and not the case. The
yeah.
reason to say yes is not so that people don't look down on you. It's to get those opportunities. I mean, if my view of this was always, if I work harder and take on more stuff than other lawyers at my level, I am going to have more experience than
Wow.
those lawyers more quickly, and that will allow me to take on bigger and bigger challenges more quickly than others in my cohort. That was always my attitude, and it's one of the reasons why I've been able to, you know, lead cases from a relatively early stage and take on bigger and bigger challenges at a pace that has been very satisfying, but also very aggressive. And that has leads me to the second imperative, which is that doing that and having that kind of career or not, like you don't have to be driving yourself as hard as I think I've pushed myself. You can just be dealing with the regular stresses and strains of a law practice because this is a stressful profession, and there's basically no way to do it that isn't stressful, at least some of the time. The second imperative is you've got to know what you need as a human in order to bring your very best self and all of yourself to the job most of the time. And I say most of the time because sometimes, you've got a client who's been served with an application for an injunction and the hearing is next week, and there goes your weekend because you're getting ready for court and there's
Wow.
no way around that. And you are not going to be at 100% when you get to the end of multiple all-nighters and the sort of thing that we have to do when we're dealing with those sort of urgent cases. So and there might be cases where for weeks or even months at a time, you are really grinding hard
Yeah.
and it does take a toll, and you just have to know that these things don't last forever and be willing to pay that short-term price in order to be part of the team, the project, the excitement and the opportunity that a big case like that means. But subject to those time-limited exceptions, knowing like what you need in order to be a healthy person. Like for me, I've got to get to the gym a couple times a week. It can be for 15 minutes, but I
Wow.
need to get my heart rate up and get away from the office and do that in order to feel like a fully formed, functioning human. For me, I've got to spend time with my husband. I've got to spend some time with my grandmother who lives here in Toronto. I've got to be in touch with my parents who are in Vancouver. I've got to make opportunities to go back and see them over the course of the year. Those are things that I need
Wow.
and that I trade off against in order to do the job that I can do
Able to
without
sustain
compromising
that.
those.
Yeah.
Exactly. If I didn't have that, I wouldn't be able to do the work that I was describing a moment ago. So knowing what your list is, and it can be one or two or three or five things. If you want to be in a elite legal practice, it probably can't be 15 things when they're all time demanding
Yeah.
because that's not going to be possible.
Sustainable. Yeah.
But knowing what you need in order to be your best self, and then ensuring that you have those things, learning how to balance that with the demands of a legal practice and taking on as many opportunities as you can within those constraints is not intuitive. And it's something that's really hard to do, in fact, when you're new in the profession and you don't know how long things take. You don't know what cases feel like or what the trajectory of a piece of litigation or a deal is from start to finish, when they're going to be busy, when they're not going to be busy, how much of your life is this actually going to absorb, how much
Wow.
mental energy is going to be consumed by this extra case. You don't know that when you're starting out. So you got to ask, learn from your mentors, learn from your peers, and go through the process of trial and error to figure that out as fast as you can, so that by the time you get into practice after a few years, you're able to optimize the way you use every hour of every day so that you get what you need to be you, and also are able to commit to trying new opportunities, pushing yourself hard, and developing the kind of experience that is the only way to build the skills necessary to be a great lawyer.
100%. That's well eloquently said. And that balance, like you mentioned, is probably instead of it. Sometimes I look at people talk about work-life balance, and it seems very like wishy. Oh, Chat GPT, how do I say it? Like, but in terms of your end, that's a practical yet honest
Yeah.
way of looking at the profession. Just two more questions on my end in terms of this incredible interview. I'd love to know if you could speak to a younger version of yourself,
Mhm.
whether it's, Adam growing up in Vancouver or Toronto and whatnot, but, prior to getting into law school or even just before then, before you kind of begun this journey, what would you have wanted him to know that he wouldn't have been able to understand now that you're in this position?
I don't think I fully appreciated just how important my relationship with my husband would be to
Mhm.
my ability to be a successful professional. Like I mean, and I think part of this has to do with having the stunted adolescence that you did when you were a closeted gay kid in the early aughts. Even in a progressive place like Vancouver, even with accepting wonderful parents like I had, like I didn't have the experience of having relationships really until I got to university. And even then, it was very hit and miss until after I graduated. And you hear people who've been very successful tell you that the single most important decision you can make is who you're going to spend your life with, who your partner or partners will be. And that is true. I didn't appreciate just how important it was to make the time for that, to commit energy to that until I was quite well advanced in my journey through university and beyond. I was very lucky to find my husband when I did, and to have him as my support, the most important person in my life for the entire time that I've been in law practice. And I'm not sure that I would have done anything fundamentally different along the way if I'd known then what I know now. But I think that that is one of the most important insights that I've gained as I've become more middle-aged.
100%, 100%. And so, that's, I would like having a support system, even like, on my having, my parents, around me. I've seen in interviews before, in terms of you describing the wonderful, inspiration that your parents have been. I think there was an anecdote you talking about, you and your sibling started studying while your mother was working, you guys would be studying as well. And, my mother, she works working at a daycare, and obviously taking me with her growing up. Those
That's
things,
awesome.
whether it's, having like spousal relationships, parents and whatnot, I think that's certainly a nice takeaway to hear on your end. And the final and probably most important question, sorry for the misrepresentation here, is given all of your,
I think you said there were two questions to go, so
there
no
was
mis.
that, yeah. The thing is, you've had, growing up in Vancouver. Right now, you've made history as the first Vancouverite to join the podcast. But working going into the United States, growing up in Toronto. I'm curious. My hockey allegiance is right over here in terms of Vancouver. I'm curious to know, with all of these different
Yeah.
experiences, where obviously the most important part, where does that kind of kind of
So that's a good question. It's an important question. And my parents, as I mentioned earlier, grew up in Toronto. My dad, in particular, was a huge Leafs fan and moved to Vancouver in the late 70s. And there was some point in time in the 80s, early 90s, when he fully switched his allegiance to the Canucks. And he's one of these Vancouver Canucks fans who gets really annoyed when the Leafs come to town and half the stadium are people wearing Leafs jerseys, or
Uh-huh.
Flames jerseys when Calgary comes to town, or Oilers jerseys when Edmonton, you
Yeah,
got,
yeah, yeah.
because everyone moves to Vancouver because it's an amazing place to live. And so the expats from elsewhere in Canada keep their allegiances. And my dad, who had very decidedly abandoned his and assumed the Canucks fan identity, doesn't deal well with others who haven't
Okay.
made put it that way. And I, now having moved back to Toronto, I think could never go back to being a Leafs fan in the way that my dad was growing up. Will I go to the Leafs game and cheer for the Leafs? Yes. They are the team in the city that I live, and I enjoy being part of kind of the Leafs fandom and all of the psychodrama every year that entails. But my team is the Canucks. They will, I think, always be the Canucks. And so, when Vancouver comes to town, there's no question whom I'm cheering for.
Like it's crazy because you move out to Ontario and I'm never used to seeing Leafs jerseys. I've never seen this in my entire life. And then you come around 10 p.m. I gotta wait. Like, what is this? What is this dynamic? For sure. Last question I'll ask. You've given a lot of very, very valuable advice, whether it's not only in your personal life, but also just in your professional career. Sort of speaking to law students, candidly, a lot of law students right now, there's a month out from the deadline
Yep.
of like applying to jobs and whatnot, or even just, the journey in and of itself. What would you kind of say to the law student right now that's kind of in that sort of position, just trying to navigate who they are and where they're trying to work? What kind of advice do you have? I guess just closing off this incredible conversation on that.
I think be willing to ask questions. Reach out to lawyers at the firms that you're considering, not so that you can tick the box and say you talked to somebody, but to try to get a genuine sense of what it's like to work at these different firms, what their practices are like, what their careers are like. That will allow you, when you get to OCIs and then in-firm interviews, to speak in an informed way about why you actually do want to work at the firm that you're interviewing at. Gathering that information is something that every law student can do, and you should never be afraid to cold call a lawyer. I get emails from law students all the time. I always, if I can make the time, do make the time to chat, even if it's for 15 or 20 minutes. Here's what my day is like. Here's what my career is like. Here's why I love what I do. It's why I'm very excited for the opportunity to speak to you, Mo, and to
Thank you.
share some of what I love about my job with your listeners and viewers. Like, gather as much information as you can, because as a law student, you cannot possibly, especially, I mean, I didn't have lawyers in my immediate family. I have an aunt who practiced like years and years ago, but it stopped by the time I was growing up. My parents aren't lawyers, they're doctors. I didn't know what being a lawyer at a law firm was like. And you can only gain that information from asking the questions and not being afraid to put yourself out there to do that. So gather as much information as you can, and then be willing to sit quietly with the information that you've gathered and think critically about how this all fits with your life and who you are and why you went to law school and what you enjoy about being in law school and what you've done in law school that's been exciting to you. And finally, trust your gut. I remember when I was a 2L, I was fortunate to have offers from more than one firm when it got to the end of the process. And by the end of the process, there were things to be excited about every single one of them. And this is true at the start of the process too. There are things that every single law firm has about their practice, about their people, that is cool, that is exciting, that would be great to be a part of. And the only way to make the right answer is to sit quietly and trust your gut. Just
Wow.
where are your instincts telling you you should go? And the last point I'll make is it's not a life-changing decision, even though it will feel like one. I summered at one firm. It was not McCarthy's. I had an offer from McCarthy's. I turned McCarthy's down for a 2L
Wow. I
summer
didn't
job.
even, this wasn't even in the other
Yeah,
interview I saw.
yeah, no, I said thanks, but no thanks.
Wow.
I summered at another firm. I had a great experience at another firm, and enjoyed that summer opportunity. And then I went and clerked, and then knowing more and having lived a little longer and approaching the same decision again after clerking, I decided to not go back to the firm that I had summered at and to come to McCarthy's instead. And if McCarthy's hadn't been the candy land that it's been for me and given me the joy that I have found in my professional life here, and
Yeah.
that I think that it is one of the great things about our firm. If it hadn't been that, I would have gone somewhere else. Like, there's no one decision that you get to make as a lawyer or a law student that is so irreversibly, irretrievably life-changing that the stakes are as high as they will feel when you're going through this process.
Wow.
So have some grace for yourself, be patient, trust your gut, and remember, this isn't your only kick at the can when it comes to making consequential career decisions. It's a long career. You will find your place in this profession. I truly believe that, if you're willing to be self-critical, to think hard about where you fit, where you belong, what kind of excellence can you bring to our profession, and how can you best achieve it. As long as you're willing to ask yourself those questions and then listen to yourself for the answers, you're going to be just fine.
100%. And one final note, just for full context, in terms of, so you guys don't think Adam is bluffing when he's saying this. I'd mentioned, when in my initial email, that this was going to go 20 minutes. In my researching process, I said it might go 40. And now we're here an hour later, and this is probably one of the busiest lawyers you could possibly run
Well,
into. So
but
this
Mo,
is
when you give me a chance to talk about myself, I'm not going to stop, right? Like, no, no. I appreciate the opportunity.
thank
This has been
you.
a great conversation, and I'm really hoping that I've given some useful
Thank you.
information to your listeners and viewers, especially those who are in law school as they start to envision what their life as a lawyer might be like.
100%, 100%. Ladies and gentlemen, Adam Goldenberg. Thank you so much for listening.